In celebration of Betty Ford's birthday this month, April 8th, the Ford Museum was honored to have First Lady Rosalind Carter for a luncheon conversation with Steve Ford. Tonight, here at the library, we are marking Mrs. Ford's birthday with a national expert on the subject of First Ladies. Dr. Allida Black is no stranger to the Ford Library and Museum. She was the recipient of a Ford Presidential Foundation Research Travel Grant twice, first in 1996 and again in 1998. Last spring at the museum, she participated in a lively panel session during our all-day First Ladies Symposium. Her amazing career spans the world of academe, scholarship, public policy, as well as nonprofit management. She's a very eclectic individual. She is currently the managing director of the Allenswood Group, a collaborative founded to empower individuals and strengthen democracy through education. She is also a senior fellow at the Women's Research and Education Institute. In addition to these roles, she is research professor of history and international affairs at George Washington University, and in this capacity served as the founding editor and advisory board chair of the Eleanor Roosevelt Papers, a project designed to preserve and teach Eleanor Roosevelt's writings, politics, democracy, and human rights. And she is single-handedly responsible for getting all of that up on the FDR Library website. So we all owe her a tremendous bit of gratitude. She served for 2 years as executive editor of the FDR Four Freedoms Digital Initiative, which is a web-based education program dedicated to four freedoms: freedom from fear and want, and freedom of speech and worship. A prolific writer, she has written or edited 10 books, as well as a variety of articles on women and leadership, politics, and human rights policy. She has also served as an advisor to PBS and other organizations for a number of documentaries. She's a very popular lecturer, as you will find tonight, has spoken at the Smithsonian, at state and women's conferences, human rights associations, and national education organizations, and of course, tonight, the Ford Library. She has a bachelor's degree in political science from Emory University and a doctorate in history from George Washington University. Regarding her presentation this evening, Allida wrote, "History records that Betty Ford and Eleanor Roosevelt often spoke bluntly on issues they championed, with a candor that sometimes made the White House senior staff recoil, pundits leap for their pens, and citizens discuss issues that they usually chose to ignore. Only now are scholars beginning to realize the impact they had on their administration's policies and their party's electoral politics." Outspoken Women will explore the political influence these two remarkable First Ladies had on their husbands' public policy initiatives, their re-election efforts, and the national conversation about citizenship in a democracy requires. Please welcome scholar, author, speaker, and dynamic lady, Allida Black, to the Ford Library.
Hi, everybody. Don't believe a word she said. I'm very happy to be back at the Ford Library. I had great visits here when I was here. I'm profoundly grateful for the Ford Foundation for taking a risk on me, this returning scholar, to come out here and try to make some sense out of Betty Ford. And I am most profoundly grateful to my friend Lisa Tobin, who is in the audience tonight, who was the archivist who really helped me learn how to think, and who was incredibly patient with me when I asked the same question 50 times because I didn't understand it, and who took a true leap of faith and called the Fords and asked them to make time to see me. So what you will hear tonight, some of it's the first time I've ever said it publicly. So I'm very grateful for Lisa and Jim for coming tonight, because now they get to see the trouble that they're going to cause. So what I would like to do tonight is to talk about, in 45 minutes, if you know me, that's hard, why they're alike, why they're different, use some policies to sort of illustrate that, then jump into the political battles that they had both within the White House and on the campaign trail, and then look at how they both struggled in their post-White House careers to find their voice once again and to once again change the world. So that's a brief outline. And if I usually talk, 50 miles an hour, but my great friends from Freedom House, Detroit are here, and English is probably their fifth language. So I'm going to try to be slower than my usual Gatling gun pace. I'm trying, okay? I know you're going to get mad at me, but I'm trying. Okay, so what do we know about these two women other than the fact that they were blunt, that they were charismatic beyond belief, and that they captivated the world's attention? I think what we can talk about first is how different they are. First, you have Eleanor Roosevelt, the longest serving First Lady in our history. And her husband was our most often elected president. We elected him 4 times. Now you can only elect him 2 times. Okay. And then you have Betty Ford, our shortest serving First Lady, whose husband was our only unelected president. Okay? That's a big whopper right there. You have Eleanor was a teetotaler. Betty was not a teetotaler. In public, Eleanor was very private and focused. In public, Betty was flamboyant and joyful. Eleanor communicated with FDR by writing him detailed memos and highlighting letters that she had received from the general public to get him to take a certain policy position. He even had an Eleanor basket by the bed. Betty believed in pillow talk. Eleanor concealed her influence. She went to her grave denying that she changed his mind on any policy. Now, I love Eleanor Roosevelt, and I have a picture of her in every room in my house with the exception of the bathroom, where I have a telegram to John Kennedy. Betty Ford didn't influence Jerry on policy. She influenced him, however, on the 3 great decisions of his administration, which we will circle back to. Eleanor had unbelievable stamina. She makes Bill Clinton look lazy. Betty was physically challenged. Eleanor's a liberal Democrat. Betty was a Republican struggling for the soul of the Republican Party. But despite these obvious differences and their separate constituencies, these women share remarkable personal traits. And so I ask you to bear with me for a minute just to show you how inside their gut these women know each other in ways that historians have not taken the time to acknowledge. First, they gave up careers that they loved, careers that they cherished, to support their husband's political ambitions. They both did not, desperately did not want to be First Lady. They both moved into the White House in times of the gravest crises the country's ever faced in the 20th century. Eleanor Roosevelt in the Great Depression, when we had between 30 and 35% unemployment, when 1/2 of all mortgages in the United States were 1 paycheck or 1 mortgage payment away from foreclosure, when we had lost 40% of the American economy and it would never come back. Betty Ford came in the throes of Watergate, in the throes of impeachment, when we had the biggest constitutional crisis the country had faced during the Civil War, and we were trying to figure out how to end the Vietnam War, when women were beginning to articulate their own pent-up desires for economic equality, and when the civil rights movement and the labor movements were going through a huge identity crisis, and our Vice President of the United States was going to jail for kickbacks and corruption, while the President of the United States was facing a congressional indictment for impeachment. So they were the two hugest crises. They both suffered what Eleanor called the clutch of fear at their hearts, because people had tried unsuccessfully to murder their husbands. Their husbands survived assassins' bullets at close range. They understood in a very intimate, personal, terrifying way the cost of leadership. They both saw the press devour their children and ridicule their husbands. And they forced their husbands and their party to deal with issues that the party leaders just don't want to talk about. They want to send them away. They don't even want to think about the living wage. They don't even want to think about abortion. They don't want to think about how you're going to pardon conscientious objectors from World War I. They don't want to think about lynching. They don't want to think about federal supports of the arts. And the West Wing staff, the president's staff, or as Eleanor was fond to call them, the boys, are, in Betty's words, clueless on how to use them. They both refuse to be scripted. They both champion in a profoundly outspoken way that criticize their husbands' policies on women in the first month of the administration, all of which garners front-page news, not just around the United States, but around the world. And last but not least, they become huge issues in their own right in campaigns. In 1940, when FDR is running for a third term for President of the United States, the first campaign button the Republicans printed were, "We don't want Eleanor either." And so they are both very important politically for the key constituencies that they bring into their husbands' coalitions. For Eleanor, it's Eleanor more than FDR that makes the Democratic Party the party of African Americans. It's Eleanor Roosevelt why the Democrats say goodbye to Lincoln and hello to the party of FDR. She speaks out against lynching. She speaks out against the poll tax. She refuses Secret Service protection, drives herself around the country, and spends so much time involved in African American communities that the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, J. Edgar Hoover, one of my favorite people to trash in American history, wanted her declared colored, officially stripped of her citizenship, declared a communist, and shipped off to live with her people, the coloreds, in Liberia, and wanted to convene a special meeting of the Senate Judiciary Committee to make this happen. Well, with Betty, let's look. Abortion. Well, is Susan going to have an affair or is Susan not going to have an affair? What about the Equal Rights Amendment? What about a woman on the Supreme Court? What about that silly green button for whip inflation now, or the win buttons that she says to Jerry, quote unquote, are too stupid for words and they have got to go. So they have a lot in common. But I think, to put all jokes aside, and I've really tried to struggle with this in my own mind, and this is the first time that I've really articulated it, so I hope I'm clear. But most important, they understood the depths of the nation's despair. They understood our fear. They understood what happens when your understanding of the justice in your country implodes. They understand how fear can cripple your spirit, how you can assume responsibility for something that's not your fault, and they risk themselves in ways that I find jaw-droppingly brave to embolden the nation to come back and say, this is my country, I'm going to take it back, and it will be good again. It will be a struggle. It will not be easy. We are going to have to figure out how to talk to each other. We're going to have to keep everybody at the table as opposed to throwing people away from the table. And they risked their physical health, their mental health, in Eleanor's case, all of her own income, and in Betty's case, probably a good piece of her heart to try to get America to see that government can, in fact, work. Now, we don't think about these women this way. You know, we think about Betty and that fabulous, David Kennerly poster where she's dancing on the table, and we think about Eleanor at the Marian Anderson concert or square dancing with miners in West Virginia. We don't think about why they did this. And so what I'd like to do is to take just a few minutes to talk about the policy issues that Eleanor did, and oh my God, I could talk about this for 10 weeks. So I'm going to try to pick some and maybe do Eleanor in 5 minutes looking at the clock. And then I'm going to spend a little more time on Betty, and I'm going to go back to when Betty begins to talk about Eleanor and talk about them both at the same time going through. Is that okay? Does that make sense? Okay. So Eleanor really does more policy than Betty. And Eleanor is not a policy geek, but she has spent her whole life working on specific policies that she wants to see implemented. It is a myth that Eleanor becomes political after FDR has polio. That is the acceptable cover story. That's the story that Eleanor and FDR and Louis Howe sort of spun to give Eleanor cover to go do this. Eleanor starts doing politics the day she comes back from Allenswood Academy when she's 18 years old. And she begins to volunteer in settlement communities where she gets involved in sanitation issues, where she becomes a heartfelt champion of a living wage, where she begins a lifelong commitment to safe immigration policy, where she really understands that housing and food are the most fundamental of all human rights. And so this is one of the multiple attractions that FDR sees in this young woman who becomes reacquainted with on a train going to Hyde Park. She gets it. And not only that, she's teaching herself the language of the people with whom she is working. She is trying to teach herself Hebrew. She speaks French. By the end of her life, she will be totally self-educated. She only had 4 years of school. I'm not talking college. I'm not talking professional school. I'm talking 4 years of school. And this is the woman who will be the primary architect and broker of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And she will teach herself Spanish, Italian, German, passable Russian, French, and English. And when she is dying at the age of 78, there are UN representatives from 4 African nations that are coming up to Valkill to meet with her, and she is trying to teach herself basic Swahili so that she can greet them in their native tongue when they come to her house to have a picnic to talk about human rights. So this is a woman that we don't know. But so what we know is that we know that FDR is intrigued by her. And so by the time that he's president and she becomes first lady, Eleanor has a substantial political career in her own right. All the papers in the country, every single major paper, run a full page ad on Eleanor's political career during the 1932 campaign. She becomes seen as the power behind the throne. Sam Rosenman, FDR's great speechwriter, says, well, now that he's won, the first thing we've got to do is get the pants off of Eleanor and on to Frank. True story. And it really happens in the fourth day. 1, 2, 3, fourth day. The Roosevelt's first term in the White House, when FDR issues the Economy Act. And what the Economy Act did was said that if you were a couple and both of you worked for the federal government, well, by women, you lost your job, because he was going to cut the federal payroll by 25%. And he was going to cut it on the backs of the women workers. Eleanor didn't like that. Eleanor holds a press conference in the White House to say to her husband, you can't do this, Franklin. This is wrong. And they have dueling editorials in the paper. It's the first week of the Roosevelt administration, and they're fighting about policy in the paper. Then when he goes and begins to do the Civil Conservation Corps, she goes, where are the women? And so Eleanor fights to get the she camps set up. Now she only gets 4, but there are 4 camps that support unemployed women. Let's jump to Social Security. Eleanor said, FDR's right, it is a stool. FDR said there's a 3-pronged stool. The stool is Social Security, personal retirements, and God help us all, corporate pensions. Okay? Eleanor said that's wrong. It's never going to work unless there's a fourth leg in the stool. Anybody want to guess what the 4th leg was? Health care. Okay, so she lost that battle. Circle back to the Economy Act. In 1935, FDR signs a new law reinstating the federal women who lost their jobs in 1933. It's called the Economy Act of 1935. And, in my opinion, the greatest of the New Deal acts can be traced not only to Frances Perkins, the Secretary of Labor, but to Eleanor Roosevelt. The Fair Labor Standards Act, minimum wages and maximum hours. That's Eleanor's impact on the New Deal. Now, how does this relate to Betty? Betty's real policy impact was to support the National Endowment for the Arts. That's what she adopted. That's what she wanted to do. Well, the reason that we have a National Endowment for the Arts is, because of Jackie Kennedy, because of Lyndon Johnson, but it is really because of Eleanor Roosevelt. Because it is Eleanor Roosevelt who convinces FDR in 1935 to sign 2 executive orders that deal with unemployed segments that are too controversial to get through Congress. The first is youth, so you set up the National Youth Administration, which is the precedent for today's AmeriCorps. The second is the Federal One programs, which are the federal theater projects, drama projects, artist projects, and music projects. Those are the statutory precedents for the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Endowment for the Arts. And then, of course, Eleanor was, as I said earlier, profoundly outspoken on the issues of race. So why am I just giving you this whole litmus test? By the time that FDR seeks his reelection for a 3rd time, Eleanor Roosevelt has endured 11 assassination attempts. Not threats, attempts. People shoot at her. The Ku Klux Klan places the largest bounty in its history on her head. They wrap dynamite around the axles of her tires. She understands in her gut, as she will say over and over and over, we are all on trial to show what democracy means. So let's fast forward to the war. Eleanor is blamed for a race riot in Detroit in 1943 because she is so involved with the incomparable Walter Reuther in having the Sojourner Truth housing project built in Detroit. A whopping 24 African-American families who all worked in the defense industries were scheduled to move into this apartment building. They were met when they're trying to unload by 3,000 white Detroit residents with 1-inch lead pipes wrapped in barbed wire, weapons, burning crosses, and baseball bats with 16-penny nails driven through them. They're repelled from the housing project. Congress held hearings. They say one member of Congress who represented Detroit said that he would totally defund the government if FDR continued to employ that N-word loving Clark Foreman. FDR sort of transfers Clark Foreman to a different thing, and Eleanor hires him. A year later, a race riot erupts in Detroit. It is a white on black riot. It lasts 2.5 days. Stun bombs are dropped on Detroit. Eleanor is blamed for the race riot by both the Mississippi Press and the New York Times that say, "It's blood on your head, Mrs. Roosevelt." And so Eleanor finally gets to go to the Pacific because, as the vice president writes in his diary that night, Mrs. R gets to go to the Pacific because the Negro situation is too hot. She flies an uninsulated military aircraft. Her eardrum shatters. She goes deaf in one ear. The first 2 days that she's there, she walks 50 miles of hospital corridors. Her arches fall. She can never stand again without wearing special shoes. She's in foxholes. She's in submarines. She's in uninsulated military aircraft. She begins to carry a prayer in her wallet that she will carry for the rest of her life, which is, "Dear Lord, lest I continue in my complacent ways, help me to remember that somewhere someone died for me today. And if there be war, help me to remember and to answer, am I worth dying for?" The war, she writes a dear friend, fills me with the greatest sense of responsibility that I dread that I will never be able to discharge. So she comes back to the United States in 1943. The first place that she goes is an interracial canteen in New York City, sponsored by the CIO, where there's interracial dancing. The death threats on her escalate. Now let's switch to Betty. Unlike Eleanor, Betty didn't have a political agenda or a political career going into the White House. As she so often said, she was an accident of history. You know, an accident of history that happens when the nation is divided over, is Nixon a crook? Is Nixon not a crook? Is Pat an innocent bystander? Is Pat plastic? Why is Nixon sending his daughter out to defend him rather than his attorney? What about the Equal Rights Amendment? Are women full citizens? Are women not citizens? What about abortion? What about Vietnam? How are we going to end the war in Vietnam? And what are we going to do with the soldiers who come home who have post-traumatic stress? And what are we going to do with the young men who fled the country rather than go in the war? When Betty Ford and Gerald Ford suddenly become the second family, Betty is somewhat traumatized. And she tells a reporter for the Ann Arbor News, "Look, I'm just going to be plain Betty Ford. the exact same thing that Eleanor Roosevelt tells Lorena Hickok the night that FDR wins the election. I never wanted to be a president's wife. I'm just going to be plain old Mrs. Roosevelt. I'm going to get criticized no matter what I do. But the press begins to see that Betty, like Eleanor, will tell you what she thinks and she doesn't back off. She's very worried that Jerry is going to be tarnished or stained or somehow corrupted by association with Nixon. And even though Barbara Walters sandbags her on the Today Show by saying that, yeah, you can come talk and I'll just ask you questions about your family and your kids. And the first question is, do you support Roe v. Wade, which is the abortion case? Betty sort of and says, well, it's time to get it out of the backwoods and into the hospital where it belongs. She endorses the Equal Rights Amendment, and she says she's a feminist. That's not bad for the first national interview with Barbara Walters, for the second lady of the United States, who everybody with an IQ over 12 knows is going to be the next first lady. So, unlike Jerry, she realizes that Nixon's exit is unavoidable. And so when when Nixon's chief of staff, Alexander Haig, talks to Nixon about the pardon, talks to Jerry about the pardon, and Jerry comes home to tell Betty, in their words to me, Betty erupted. That's a quote from both Fords. She said, "You can't do that." So they become First Lady. I want you to think about this. Gerald Ford is taking the oath of office. Betty Ford is holding the Bible. I want you to think about Eleanor's prayer. Help me to remember to ask, am I worth dying for? What Betty Ford understood was the number one obligation that the Fords had was to return the White House to the American people, to open it up, to not make it be a besieged, sort of castle with all of the bridges drawn up, but that it is, in fact, the people's house. And so when Jerry takes the oath of office, she literally says in her own mind, I, Elizabeth Bloomer Ford, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute da-da-da-da-da. She says the oath of office to herself while he is taking it. I want you to imagine in your heart and in your gut the tension and the fear that felt. She says she felt pinned to the floor. So what does she do? She says she wants to open the White House and make it friendly to the American people and not just to members of Congress. She opens it back up to tours. She says, Jerry, we're not having private worship services in here. That's what Nixon did. No, thank you very much. We're going out to church. And the Secret Service wants to go. The Secret Service can go, but they can't get in the way. And she travels with him to Chicago for the most controversial decision, his first controversial speech, which will be whether or not to grant amnesty to the men who left the United States to go to Canada. You did not see Pat Nixon do that. You did not see Julie Nixon do that. Plus, she meets with the press, just as Eleanor Roosevelt starts having her own press conferences with women members of the press corps. So does Betty Ford, and she has the first White House press conference by her First Lady since 1952. And she tells people that they're going to sleep in the same room, that they've got their beds moved back, that, they rehash the Equal Rights Amendment, they rehash women going to law school, they rehash equal pay for equal work, they rehash abortion. What comes out of that? Oh my God, the Fords are going to sleep in the same room in their own bed. you know. And so Betty gets all criticized about this. And one great writer says, why is everybody so worried? Romance has returned to the White House. Now, I want you to think about this. You can say many kind things about, Richard and Patricia Nixon, but you can never think of them as romance has returned to the White House. Betty Ford is compared to Stephanie Powers, who plays Jennifer Hart, in the old TV show, Heart to Heart. And then, when she decides to go public with her mastectomy, and also public that she does not have reconstructive surgery, the outpouring of letters here that are preserved in the library will just give you a sense of how much she embraced that fear, understood what that meant to a couple who were battling that, and how that was yet another way of making sure that the White House belonged to the American people. Because people who were there got sick too. And people who got sick had cancer. And you didn't say cancer. And you certainly didn't talk about mastectomy. So it's all part of her understanding of opening the White House up. She takes credit when Jerry signs the proclamation making 1974 the year of the woman. And to really sort of jump ahead big time, my favorite image of all of Betty Ford is during the 1976 Republican Convention. Now, the Republican Party in 1976 is as divided as the Republican Party is now. They just don't have the charismatic people now that they had in 1976. I mean, it's hard to beat Betty Ford on the one hand and Nancy Reagan on the other. And they literally have dueling entrances into the convention where they try to step on each other's toes. Betty's introduced, and while she's getting applause, here comes Nancy coming in with the band playing California, Here I Come, trying to knock Betty out. So the next night, Betty says, I can play this game too. So she puts Tony Orlando and Don right next to her in the booth, and Nancy comes out, and the band plays Tie a Yellow Ribbon Around the Old Oak Tree, and Betty Ford and Tony Don start doing the bump, And so who's the camera going to look at? Betty Ford and Tony Don doing the bump, which is a dance, where you do like that, and I can't dance. They know I can't dance. So it's huge. And the battle of the convention is much about the battle between what Nancy represents and what Betty represents as it is between Nixon and Reagan. So why is there such a fight over who is going to get the Republican nomination? Why doesn't the Republican Party stay with their seated president? Well, I think there are three things that you can look at. The whip inflation now, the money part didn't work. And there's certainly the controversy of amnesty. Betty told Jerry, this is not working, get rid of those buttons. She totally supported amnesty. She understood the backlash that it would create. And most importantly of all, she supported the Nixon pardon. Now I want you to go back to what I talked about. When Haig first broaches it, she says, are you crazy? It's a quid pro quo. You've got to let it go through the process. The country's going to demand a trial. You've got to stay away. You've got to stay away. You've got to stay away. When Nixon resigns, there is a bleeding wound in the middle of the country, I think. That he can compare it to a bleeding ulcer. Some people rejoiced I was 23 years old, as only the arrogance of a 23-year-old could do. I went to Ambets and bought a pink organdy apron that says Fannie Farmer Bakes on it and baked my first cake from scratch. I thought, we have taken our country back. He's gone, the crook is gone. But the issue becomes, is that the arrogance of somebody who was 23 and who opposed the war in Vietnam? Or was that a sigh of relief around the country that we don't have him on the front pages anymore? And so when I was fortunate enough to visit the Fords to ask them about the election, I asked them about the Nixon pardon. And I asked Mrs. Ford, because she refers to it in a really sort of understated way in her autobiography, another way of talking about it in A Glad Awakening, and sort of other ways in interviews. I said to her, did you support the pardon? Can you walk me through the pardon? And I said, I've grappled with this for a long time, and I really want to understand on a personal basis why the president pardoned. And so she told me that they both sat on the beds, they prayed, they cried, they walked around, they talked, they went to bed, they couldn't sleep, they woke up, they got down on their hands and knees and prayed, they talked some more. People were advising the president not to pardon him. There were other people that were advising him to pardon. At this point, President Ford walked out into the living room because he was getting ready to go to Washington to stand with Bill Clinton while they were doing NAFTA, because all of the living former presidents were going to have a joint press conference on the North American Free Trade Agreement. And so President Ford came and sat on the sofa. And he said to me, and this is a direct quote, "The biggest influence on my decision to pardon Richard Nixon was Betty. Anybody who says anything different is more invested in rewriting history than in telling history." So if you look at the fundamental, the fateful decision of the Ford presidency, the decision to pardon Richard Nixon, it was Betty Ford. That does not take away from his decision, but that's who he talked it over with, and that's whose counsel he listened to. So how does this play out in a campaign? It's brutal. It's the first sort of internecine Republican campaign since 1948. When liberal Republicans and liberal Democrats split off to form the Progressive Party, and when conservative Republicans and conservative Democrats split off to form the Dixiecrat Party. But Betty is a huge asset to the presidency. Her poll numbers, like Eleanor's, are rock solid, and people hate them too. So she's got awful hate numbers and off the charts big numbers. And the campaign begins to realize that Betty can really be an asset. But they don't know what to do with her, and they want to control her. And so one of the major ironies is that Haig, who had written this memo to her on how to be a first lady, which she totally and completely discounts, which just says, don't do anything, literally go upstairs and have your pictures taken by all of your predecessors that came before. And she says, no, I'm not going to do that. I have to have a staff. You've got to help me do things. They once again try to script her on the campaign the way she was not scripted during the primary. And it backfires because her voice is silent. She's speaking for the White House rather than being her own authentic self. And then, of course, she's trying to do damage control for the 60 Minutes interview when Morley Safer asked her what would she do if Susan had an affair. And she said, well, I hope she would come to me and talk about it, which I always thought was an extraordinarily maternal thing to say. But, you know, the boys in the White House are freaking out about it. Well, by September, Jimmy Carter, my old boss, makes a fundamental mistake, and in Playboy, as opposed to 60 Minutes, talks about having lust in his heart. And Betty's going, let me at him. I mean, really, she wants to go out there. Because what's happening is, and the poll data shows this from suburban women, they show that the objections that, you know, the fury that they got over the 60 Minutes interview, because they didn't respond to it immediately, they let it play out and fester and sort of become a story upon a story upon a story. Once they finally started doing damage control and the numbers, her disapproval ratings started going down, and it was very clear that Gerald Ford loved his wife, that they were a loving couple in the White House, Jimmy Carter starts talking about lust in his heart in Playboy, for God's sake, next to the centerfold. And so she begins to go to suburban women. And when she goes to suburban women in the Midwest and in the Northeast, because remember, Carter is a born-again Baptist, and Rosalind is seen as a peanut farmer's wife. And so there's a huge class bias outside of the Democratic strongholds of New York City, and you're playing to the suburbs. Betty rocks the suburbs. So as the election draws to a close, the biggest question to me is why they never sent Betty back to Cleveland, Cincinnati, and Columbus. Because every time she went there, the poll numbers went up and they stayed up. They didn't drop. I fully believe, and President Ford and Betty Ford, who cannot answer why they didn't send her back there, believed that it was a fundamental mistake of the campaign. That if Betty had, in fact, appealed to suburban women in Ohio, that Ohio would have voted for Ford and we would not have had Carter. It is the only time, I think, that you can prove in American history with statistics, Avery, that a First Lady made a difference in a campaign. So let's go back in our next 5 minutes, to talk about the defeat, the unexpected defeat. Both Eleanor and Betty had tremendous heartbreak at the end of their times in the White House. FDR dies. Eleanor finds out that the people who were with him when he died were people that he swore to her that he would never see again, and that her daughter facilitated that. It's a pretty hard thing to take. She thought, as much as she did not want to be in the White House, that he could work on the UN, Truman could really do a lot of work with domestic policy, and that she, in fact, could help Truman really master sort of the ethnic, racial, class politics of the United States that he had never dealt with, coming from a pretty homogenous state of Missouri. She and FDR had planned to take the train trip together for 2 weeks to go from Washington to California and sort of get to know each other again. She was intimately involved in the planning of the United Nations. She looked, because she had been very involved and a huge defender of the World Court. She was close to Sistenius. She was close to Charles Taussig, who were the staff that were really soaring to help FDR sort of reshape the world without empire, to move from mandates to trusteeships to independence. She very much looked forward to having the New Deal reassert itself after the war. All that's gone. She feels very much that it's her children's turn now. Here's Betty. He's so exhausted, he can't give a concession speech, and so she has to read the concession speech for her husband. She's furious. Furious. She's scared, she's furious, and she's personally terrified. She had gone from becoming Mrs. Gerald R. Ford to Betty. And what's going to happen to Betty without the White House? What these two women do show remarkable acts of courage. Betty confronts her addictions. She begins to think about how can she build a new life? And who does she look to when she begins to deal with sobriety and founding a new life? She told me she looked to Eleanor Roosevelt in the UN, and she looked to Eleanor Roosevelt in civil rights. Because as you redefine yourself and you want to stand on what you've built, and you have been outspoken, and you love being outspoken, and you have a constituency there that is supportive of you and will let you stumble and get back up and still love you and embrace you, you suck it up and you go back. So I would argue that the outspokenness that Eleanor Roosevelt demonstrated in the White House manifests itself in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in the NAACP's campaign against lynching, in Brown versus the Board of Education, in the Civil Rights Act of 1957, in the Civil Rights Act of 1960. And I would argue that Betty Ford's amazing ability to assume responsibility for something she had never envisioned doing is totally and completely personified in the Betty Ford Center, where she is not only outspoken for herself, but outspoken for every person in the United States who is addicted to alcohol, who is addicted to medicines, and every person in the United States who loves a person who battles those demons. And so I think that they are gifts to the nation. I think they are models for people who know how to speak their mind. They're models for people who know how to stumble and get back up. And they are models of people who understand how to love their country, what citizenship requires, and it takes an unfathomable courage and faith to become that bold. And they leave us both a legacy. So I ask you to ask and remember, are you worth dying for? I thank you very much. Oh, please, please, please. I'll be happy to answer any questions, and you can tell me you don't believe me. That's okay.
Hi, welcome to Ann Arbor. We're glad to have you here, and boy, this was fabulous.
Oh, thank you. I'm happy to be back.
Good. I would like to encourage you to do a book with Eleanor Roosevelt and maybe Jane Addams, because...
Oh, my God.
Oh, I know. You know, they were both visionaries. They both knew how to network. They got into the trenches to make the world better. Mm-hmm. And they were beloved by many, many people. But my question is, would you give us a little information about the differences between Eleanor and Betty on the Equal Rights Amendment?
Okay. Yay! I was hoping somebody was going to ask that question. You took the bait very well. Betty was an adamant champion of the Equal Rights Amendment. Eleanor came to the Equal Rights Amendment very gradually and dropped her objection to it. but I'm going to tell you why. When Eleanor began to look at how women worked, what she saw were 18-hour days, standing up, literally in some cases being handcuffed to chairs, working for minimum wages. And she believed that if, in fact, we got an Equal Rights Amendment, that it would undo all of the labor protections that she had worked so hard to put into place. And she believed passionately that without Mueller versus Oregon, which is the great statute about minimum wage and maximum hours, Supreme Court case, minimum wage and maximum hours for workers, that we never would have gotten the Fair Labor Standards Act. And the Fair Labor Standards Act was minimum wage and maximum hours. And it was not just in unionized places. And so she wanted to protect that. And so she opposed the Equal Rights Amendment because she thought that that would give the corporations the power to sue in court to remove legislation that benefited men and women. But when women began to advance in the labor movement, when women began to be vice presidents of unions, when there is a series of statutory law that enforces this in the late 50s and early 60s, Eleanor drops her objection, and she will no longer say that she is opposed to it. She just will not say that I'm going to go out and campaign for it. Does that make sense? It does. Okay. Sure. Who's next? Oh, you guys are timid. Okay.
Thank you for your talk. Could you elaborate, did Betty elaborate more when she advised President Ford about the pardon? Did she elaborate on her reasoning, or did he elaborate to you about that?
They thought that the country was so divided right now that they had begun to breathe, that now that Nixon was out of the White House and they had begun to really turn the White House back into a symbol of the American people, that if we put Nixon on trial, he would fight it so much that the trial would last for years. And that going on for years would not let the country move forward and get past it. And that it could begin again to degenerate into a huge partisan battle, and they very much wanted to avoid that. Betty really thought, she told President Ford that she could see that the trial could last a decade. And do you want to have a decade with Nixon looming over everything that's coming, or do you want to end the war? Do you want to deal with the economy? Do you want to deal with other more pressing social controversies that were really threatening to rip the country apart too? Did that answer your question? Wherever you went, sorry.
Yeah. Thank you for your discussion of the political and personal courage of these two first ladies. But even today, women are getting all kinds of advice, women in the workplace, from lean in,
Stand up.
to the
Sorry,
impossible
I'm not a lean in
challenge
person, sorry.
of combining high-level jobs with family life. What do you think Eleanor Roosevelt and Betty Ford would have said to these challenges of today and to the advice we're getting today?
I'll tell you what Eleanor would have said. She said it. She said, women deserve a career just as men deserve a career. But for women to really succeed, they need a wife. That's a quote. But I think that, Eleanor was, there are different generations. Eleanor very much believed in quality, affordable daycare. In fact, the first government-funded daycare we have is for women who are working in the defense industries, because they've got to work from 11 at night until 7 in the morning, and their babies end up sleeping in cars in parking lots because there's no place to take them. And Eleanor would say that it would be very hard to have an enormous career and be a fabulous parent without help. And she believed very much that the more that children had, or the more people children had around them who loved them, the stronger that the children would be. I mean, it's her way of saying what Hillary Clinton would say in terms of it takes a village. And part of that is from Eleanor's own experience, because she had such a profoundly unhappy childhood. I mean, her mother was a cold, heartless bitch. I mean, there's just not another word for it. I mean, she told her she was too ugly, she was her biggest embarrassment of her life, that she was going to die an old maid and be locked in an attic. You know, when she dies when she's 6 years old. And her father, whom she adores, is a drunk and a junkie. You know, and so she has to really figure out who she is and how she can really get past that. And she writes this very young boy, African-American boy, who's really beaten severely in a public school. When he writes her in the late 50s, and he's going to a water fountain, and there's not a colored or a white sign over the water fountain. He's getting one of those little, you know, paper cups, those little cone cups. And he's beaten so severely there's blood on the cup. And he writes her, and he sends her this letter. You know, and Eleanor keeps the cup. I've held the cup in my hand. And she writes this young boy, and she said, I can only imagine, you know, the pain and the fear that you feel. School is supposed to be a safe place. You know, and here you are, you know, people are beating on you. She said, the only thing that I can tell you is that courage is more exhilarating than fear, and in the long run, it is easier. All you have to have is the courage to look yourself in the mirror and take one step at a time. And so if you look at that, and you compare to Betty, one step at a time, you know, you have huge feelings of fear, of inferiority, of are people going to come, you know, wallop you, or are you going to descend in the bottle? And I think that it's the people around you who help you find that courage and then empower you to act on it. And so I think that Eleanor would say, if women have people around them and husbands contribute to parenting, it will work. But she will also say, you know, like Anne Marie Slaughter, if it's, you know, it's breadwinning versus caregiving. And if two couples want to have a huge, high-powered CEO career where they're both working all the time, then don't have children. She's pretty blunt about that. I can't speak to Betty that well about that. I'm sorry, I just don't know. Anybody else? I mean, my God, I've never had anybody be this quiet. I'm serious. I'm sorry? No, they never met. They, there was, I mean, I know that she had conversations about Eleanor Roosevelt with her dear friend Lindy Boggs. Betty had conversations with Lindy Boggs about Eleanor Roosevelt, because Eleanor took Lindy Boggs under her wing when Lindy and Hale Boggs came to Washington. And Betty Ford was also very close to Lady Bird Johnson. And President Johnson and President Roosevelt weren't close, but Johnson looked at Roosevelt as like the father he never had. And so we know that Lady Bird and Eleanor knew each other, and Johnson, interestingly enough, was the only president other than FDR to really treat Eleanor as a political brain. And some of the best letters are between Johnson and Eleanor, just, deciding about where to put a comma in the Civil Rights Bill of 1957. So, you can imagine some conversations about that. Okay, and Lindy Boggs told me that, but she couldn't remember what they talked about. Anybody, the question was, did Betty Ford and Eleanor ever meet? Anybody else? Yeah, go ask another one. You can go if you're bored.
I love coming to the Ford because I can always ask questions. How about the relationship between Betty and Susan Ford and Eleanor and Anna, I believe, the daughter who kind of found herself in the middle of trying to protect Franklin and her, she wasn't really trying to hurt Eleanor, whereas she said she was protecting her father and kind of helping things. But what about the mother and daughter?
That's debatable.
I agree. But how about the mother
You
and daughter?
should ask Jim Tobin if he will come up with me and rehash the fight that we
Okay,
had at
where's
breakfast
Jim
this morning.
Tobin? No, there he is.
Okay,
I see him.
sorry.
He's just sitting there.
That's okay. We argued this at breakfast this morning. I think that from the beginning, now I haven't looked at Mrs. Ford's relationship with her children. I mean, I can't talk about it the way that I can talk about Eleanor's stuff. But my strong, probable, I'll bet the mortgage suspicion is that Mrs. Ford and Susan had a fabulous relationship from nanosecond. I mean, it's like when Mrs. Ford sort of has her breakdown and Susan's aid. I mean, it's Susan that's in the car with her at the beach. It's Susan that really helps with the intervention. I mean, it's, they're close. Eleanor doesn't parent a lot. That's not a criticism. It's, sort of the custom of her class. And she also had Sarah Delano Roosevelt, who's a very interesting person and is not the cookie cutter stereotype evil mother-in-law that everybody says she is. But FDR never backed Eleanor on any discipline decision. None of the kids can ever remember that. And Sarah overrode everybody because Sarah had the money. Okay, and so and Eleanor didn't have a mother, so she didn't, she didn't know how to do this. And there's a class thing too about who's supposed to do the parenting. And so Anna is very jealous of Louis Howe's presence in the family after FDR gets stricken with polio. And their relationship is very fraught. And it's painful and somewhat estranged. And Anna rebels and marries a John Birch Society member, Curtis Dahl. And has 2 children, and the marriage falls apart and moves into the White House. At that point, she and Eleanor become very, very close. And it will be Eleanor who will sort of be the Cupid, the intermediary, if you will, with John Bottinger. And they become exceedingly close. It's difficult when Anna, the war years are very difficult because the Roosevelts are estranged during the war. Blanche Cook is very right, when Louis Howe dies, who's FDR's great political advisor, there's nobody that can keep them together. I mean, who can have equal import with both of them. And Anna could have, but she didn't. But at the end, the circle comes back. I think, Jim will disagree with me, I think Eleanor is more distraught that Anna arranged Lucy going to be with FDR than Lucy coming back. Okay? And it takes a while for them to repair that, but to their great credit, they do. And that's really an extraordinary thing. I mean, I think that's an extraordinary thing about the Roosevelt marriage, is that they learned to love each other in new ways and give each other freedom. And I don't mean open marriage crap. I mean allow them to be the people that they wanted to be, that the country needed them to be, so that we could get through what we had to go through. Anybody else? Yes, sorry. Well, there's no doubt in my mind. Oh, the question was, who in current day would I think be Eleanor Roosevelt and who would be Betty? I have to think about Betty. But I can tell you without a shadow of my doubt, having worked with her off and on for 20 years, that it's Hillary Clinton. Okay, there's not a doubt in my mind. And Hillary does policy in a way that Eleanor does not do policy. But Hillary converses with people around the world on a one-on-one basis in an open forum, in an unscripted way that is exactly what Eleanor would do when Eleanor traveled. And in terms of understanding what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights means and the battle that it takes to implement that, and that it is not just taking away from people, it's not taking away from people, it's adding to, and that with citizenship has rights, but rights can be protected as much as people have the responsibility to, in fact, embrace their citizenship and learn that we are all interdependent as much as we are independent. And Hillary Clinton gets that. In terms of Betty, oh, wow, I hadn't thought about this. I really have to think about this. Well, I'm torn for Betty. I would say Ellen DeGeneres or Angelina Jolie. Joyful, flamboyant, cut to the chase, have a great marriage, have a double mastectomy, go public in the New York Times, the sexiest woman in the world, adopt kids from war zones, champion the arts, Okay. Boy, I never thought of that before. Anyway.
Last question.
Towards the end of her life, Nancy Reagan and Betty Ford become pretty good friends. Can you elaborate on that evolution?
No. Sorry. I find that hard to believe.
It's Rosalind Carter.
Yeah, it's Rosalind Carter.
On the Facebook, they talk all the time.
It's Rosalind Carter. It's Rosalind Carter. Oh, the question was, toward the end of her life, could I elaborate on why Betty Ford and Nancy Reagan became friends? And I said no. And but both Elaine and I think it's Rosalind Carter. Okay, thank you for coming.